Hi guys, welcome to another vlog. So in today's vlog, I'll discuss something interesting and something that a lot of you will be able to relate to, which is what do you do if you end up with a low GMAT score? What application strategy should you adopt? What should be your next step basically if you've ended up with a low GMAT score? I mean, this is of course assuming that you've retaken a couple of times and yet you've ended up with a not so great GMAT score, by which I mean something in the 650 or below range. So, I mean, of course, you should have retaken a couple of times, especially if there's a big gap between your scores in your practice test and your score on the actual GMAT. If there's a big difference in that, then you should definitely retake because for some reason things are not going well for you on test day. But if your practice test scores themselves are not particularly great, then retake only once you made some difference or some change to your prep. Otherwise, you will end up with the same score. So this vlog starts from the point where you've taken the GMAT 2 or 3 times. You don't intend to take it anymore because you've realized that this is basically the score that I'm gonna have to end up with. So then I'll give you two strategies that you can adopt. The first is try out the GRE. And I've said this to a lot of students, the GRE is a very different test from the GMAT. It's not necessarily easier, but it is very different. And I'll tell you how. So there is no integrated reasoning section on the GRE. There are two essays that you have to type out. Then when you talk about the math section, the math overall on the GRE is much simpler than the math on the GMAT. Of course, there are some complex questions, like there are questions in which you don't have options given to you. You have to actually type the answer. There are questions in which you can have more than one correct answer and you have to select all of them. So there are these weird questions in math, but overall, the difficulty level of math is not as high as it is on the GMAT. The GRE incidentally is scored out of 170 for math, 170 for verbal, and I think a lot of people end up with 170 in math or a 168. So it's not that difficult doing well on GRE math. So if math was your problem on GMAT, definitely look at the GRE. Talking about verbal, now the verbal on GRE is not easy by any stretch. It is as difficult as verbal on the GMAT. So then why am I recommending that you try it? Because it's very different from GMAT verbal. One big difference, there is no grammar tested on the GRE. So in case you are struggling with sentence correction on the GMAT, like most students are, it would be a good idea to try out the GRE because there is no grammar. The GRE is going to be testing you mainly on comprehension, 70% comprehension, 30% vocabulary. So vocabulary can always be improved. You can memorize list, you can work with word list, you can work with words. So there are tips and strategies to improve your vocabulary and also your comprehension. So it's not easy by any stretch, but it's very different. Critical reasoning, again, you only get 1 or 2 questions on the GRE. So sentence correction is not there, critical reasoning barely there. What is there on the GRE is not there on the GMAT. So the two are very different tests, which is why if you do badly on the GMAT, it does not necessarily mean that you will also do badly on the GRE. It's a very different test. The other big advantage with the GRE is it is not an adaptive test. At least it's not adaptive at every question level like the GMAT is. The GRE is adaptive but at a sectional level. So if the first section overall you do very well in, first verbal section, the second verbal section becomes more difficult overall. But within a section, the questions don't really change in difficulty, which is why you can skip questions within a section, you can go back to questions, you can change your answers within a section. So it's much more flexible than the GMAT. So the GRE is out of 340. Now to give you an idea, if you get a 320 on the GRE, that would be equivalent to a 660 on the GMAT. And I've seen a lot of people who kind of ended up with a 590, 600 on the GMAT, got an equivalent score of around 650, 660 on the GRE. A lot of students. Which is why I always encourage students who've got a poor score or not a great score on the GMAT to try out the GRE. People don't always listen to me. They keep banging their head against the wall and take the GMAT 6-7 times. But honestly, if you've taken it 3 times, that's more than enough. Very, very unlikely that something will happen after that. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now I'll give you a second strategy that you can use. And this is a smarter strategy that I have used quite a few times in the past and very successfully. And that is, so you have a low GMAT score, yet you're looking at kind of the top schools, whose GMAT is, let's say, 50, 60, 70 points above your GMAT score, right? So then what you do is, this is assuming that you have time, that you haven't delayed the entire GMAT taking till the very end, or otherwise apply next year. So what you do is in round 1, apply to some lower rank schools whose average GMAT is at par with your GMAT score or slightly above. So apply to a few of these schools in round 1, assuming that you have a good profile apart from the GMAT, you've got decent work ex, decent SS, you should be able to get through to at least 1 or 2 of these. Then in round 2, apply to your desired schools and tell them that you already have an admit from these schools. Because the fact that you already have an admit makes a big difference, because it adds a lot of credibility to your profile. I mean, the person who's going through your application, if he or she thinks that your GMAT score is not good, that would be countered by the fact that you already have an offer from a school or two. And don't let these be any lousy school. Apply to good schools. In every country, there are certain schools which are easy to get into and which are pretty high up in the rankings table. For example, Richard Ivey in Canada, IE in Spain, HDA Bocconi in Italy. I mean, these are all the best schools in their respective countries. On global rankings, they may not be very high up, or they may even be high up. But these are schools which are not difficult to get into. And once you have an admit from 1 or 2 of these, then you can apply to a higher ranked school, and they will view you much more favorably than they would if you did not have any admit. So it's a very interesting strategy. Make use of it. I'll give you an example. I think a couple of years back, I had a student who had a 650 on the GMAT. His desired school was ISB in India, Indian School of Business. ISB's average GMAT is around 700, 710, and they don't really consider favorably people with GMAT scores in the range of 650s and all. So this guy, what we did was we applied to Richard Ivey in Canada first. He was a very good student. The GMAT didn't work for him, but otherwise he had a strong profile, 6 years of experience, spoke well, mature person. So he had an interview call from Richard Ivey. He converted the interview. He got an admission offer. Then we applied to ISB. And he got an interview call and he converted that. And when he actually went to ISB, he called me up and he said, Sarfraz, I'm one of the lowest GMAT scores over here. And I wasn't surprised, because to get into ISB, the 650 is not easy. So while of course he was a smart guy, but the fact that he had an admit from Richard Ivey, I'm sure made a big difference in him getting the initial interview call. In fact, he also had an interview call from Oxford with the same score. So you see, the first step is just to get an interview call. After that, it's how you perform in the interview, more or less. But he did manage to get a lot of interview calls from good schools whose average GMAT score was way higher than his GMAT score. And I think the Richard Ivey admit played a big role in that. You can even use that to, negotiate for scholarships. If you're applying to schools in the same range and you have an admit from one particular school, you can leverage that at some other school, saying that, you would love to go to that school, but the scholarship is definitely a concern, or lack of it. And you will be surprised how many times the schools will increase your scholarship. So it's just a good idea to get an admit from a school. It will also make you feel confident, which will reflect in how you interact with these schools in your interviews. So don't think of it as, I don't want to go to that school, why should I apply? There's a strategic reason why you're applying there. So think like a manager, think like a consultant. So you don't necessarily have to want to go to that school or to that country, but you apply there because you plan to leverage that in some other way. So watch this video again, because the 2 tips I've given you are very, very important, very, very useful. Don't keep banging your head against the wall. If the GMAT is not working for you, try the GRE. If that's also not the case, use the second strategy that I said, and you will most likely be able to get to some good schools. At least definitely schools ranked higher than what you would have got into with your current GMAT score. So I hope you guys found this information informative, and I shall see you tomorrow in a new vlog. Have a nice day.